Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name's Dave Dulio. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department here at Oakland University. I'm also the director of our Center for Civic Engagement, and it's great to have you here for a special edition of Office Hours. If you are new to Office Hours, this is a regular occurrence that we do through the center in partnership with the Alumni Association here at Oakland University and the Office of Professional and Continuing Education. It's been a wonderful partnership where we take on important and timely topics and talk about them with experts. We highlight the expertise that we have here at Oakland University, and that's certainly the case again today with a topic that is unfortunately timely and back in the news seemingly every week. And the topic is the rise of anti-Semitic incidents across the country and notably here on college campuses. We have two experts with us today, and I should also say, if you are a repeat customer to Office Hours, thanks for coming back. It's great to have you with us today for an engaging conversation about the rise of anti-Semitism in the U.S. and on college campuses. President of Oakland University, Dr. Ora Hirsch-Peskovitz. Thank you, Madam President, for being here. And Professor Derek Hastings from the Department of History here at Oakland University. His research and expertise is in the Holocaust, Nazi Germany. There's really nobody better to talk about this than the history of anti-Semitism than Dr. Hastings. And just a couple of notes before we get started with questions. As I mentioned, this is unfortunately a timely topic, and it's not just in the last few weeks or months that we've seen this be timely, but according to the ADL, 2021 was the highest year on record of documented reports of harassment, vandalism, and violence directed against Jewish individuals. The ADL tabulated over 2,700 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States, which marks a 34% increase from 2020. And it's not just Kyrie Irving and what happened in the National Basketball Association. It's not just Ye or Kanye. It's not just those. Even just here in Michigan last week, a man used Twitter to make threats against folks in Michigan government, including Attorney General Dana Nessel, who are Jewish. On college campuses late in 2020. A Jewish symbol on the Michigan State University campus was vandalized. It was at a student's dorm. In February, there was a flurry of incidents at the University of Denver. And broadly speaking, across the country, Jewish students feel pressure to hide their Jewish identity on college campuses. In a study from Brandeis last year, over half of Jewish students said they hide their Jewish identity, and more than half avoid talking about their views on Israel. So again, this is something that is notable. And we're extremely happy to have two experts here to talk about it. So let me start with this. For somebody struggling to understand the phenomenon generally of anti-Semitism, can you give us Derek, I'll throw this one to you, and certainly President Peskovitz, jump in whenever you like. Can you give us a brief historical perspective on the origins and emergence of anti-Semitic ideas?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I can be heard, right? This is that's always good. We usually point to a couple of major developments in the first century CE. The first being the split between Christianity and Judaism. Obviously, Christianity began as a sect within Judaism. The Christian scriptures, the New Testament, are very clear about the fully Jewish identity of Jesus. There's no dispute about that. The split obviously comes with the early Christians blaming the Jews kind of collectively for the execution, for the crucifixion of Jesus. And in some of the early Christian writings, particularly the Gospel of John, we have some incredibly harsh language directed at the Jews. When you lie, you speak your native language, because You are children of the devil, the father of lies. He is your father. These sort of things, and it sort of morphs from there within Christian societies within Europe in particular. The second thing in the first century that's really important is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. This is the second temple, actually. This leads to then the scattering of the Jews out of their homeland throughout Europe, the Near East, North Africa, in the diaspora. And what this does is not only deprives the Jews of a homeland, but ensures that they're going to be perceived as a kind of outsider group in every sort of society within Christian Europe in particular. It wasn't as if the Jews had a tremendous time under Muslim control, but they had a much more, they experienced much more tolerance there than they did within Christian Europe. And we can talk a little bit more about how anti-Semitism kind of evolved if we want to later, but usually as far as the origins and early emergence, the first century CE is really important.
And how's that changed over time, right? I mean, over the centuries, what different types of anti-Semitism have circulated and
Right.
and have these different varieties interacted with each other?
Yes. So Christian anti-Semitism, or oftentimes people like to call it Christian anti-Judaism, to sort of separate it out, has kind of existed sometimes front and center, sometimes a little bit more in the background, but really in an uninterrupted way till the present. Okay, but there are various other forms that have emerged, which usually connect themselves to the time and place that we're dealing with. So in medieval Europe, for example, there was the idea of the Jewish blood libel. It's this sort of mythology that Jewish communities would capture or kidnap Christian children, kill them, and then use their blood in some sort of a ritual ceremony, baking matzah or doing whatever else. And we also see, particularly at the time of the Black Death, the plague in the 14th century, this idea that the Jews are responsible for poisoning the wells. We have various other forms of economic and cultural anti-Semitism that kind of continue up into the modern era and contribute ultimately to the type of racial anti-Semitism, which is sort of different than these other forms, in that it is much more lethal. These other forms were not non-lethal, but the sort of racial anti-Semitism preached by a movement like the Nazis viewed the Jews not as a religious group, not as a sort of, Judaism didn't have anything to do with ideas. It had everything to do with genetics and race and this kind of pseudoscientific idea. And so the solution to the quote unquote Jewish problem for a racial anti-Semite can't be solved by forced conversion, which is horrible in its own right because it destroys Jewish culture and tradition. But it can only be solved either by expulsion or by physical extermination. Sort of the Jews are seen as a pollutant genetically within the national bloodstream, as horrible as that sounds, I hope. And the only cure is to flush the Jews out of the national bloodstream. And that's sort of how we get these other forms of anti-Semitism, which have existed for quite a long time without producing something necessarily like the Holocaust, funneling into ultimately what happens in the 20th century.
And let's talk about today, right? And how anti-Semitism manifests itself. What do you, Derek and President Peskovitz, what do you see as the most likely form of anti-Semitism? How do we see it emerging? Is it overt? Is it and certainly on college campuses, I think that it comes maybe more less overtly through non-confrontation. But how do you see it exerting itself today?
Well, before we even get to the distinction between the kind of more insidious and more obvious forms, I think more recently, sort of the conspiracy idea that the Jews somehow control Hollywood and the media and the press is really kind of, I think, equivalent to the way in which the media has come to dominate people's lives. And so as anti-Semitism takes different forms during the Black Death, it took the form of poisoning of wells. I think it gloms on to other issues that are front and center in people's lives, and it kind of contributes to that directly. Now, I can speak a little bit more about like present day divisions between more obvious and less obvious divisions, but I've been talking, and I don't want to steal all of the, I don't want to step on.
Let's come back to that differentiation for sure.
I think one of the things and one of the reasons that we want to address the topic today is because we have seen more recently a significant concern about anti-Semitism on college campuses. And this is a reason why we're addressing the topic. There's been a resurgence of anti-Semitism again across the world, but specifically on college campuses. I think maybe one thing that is interesting before we actually address specifically the issue of anti-Semitism on college campuses, it would be interesting to put into perspective how many Jews are there in the world. And before I tell you, I want you each to maybe take a minute to just try to answer that question. How many Jews do you think there are in the world as a percent of the population of the world? So I'll tell you, but try to have an answer in your head. So Jews make up 0.2% of the world population. They make up 2.2% of the US population. But to a point that Derek started to talk about, there is this general sense that Jews do dominate many different parts of the world. Like you heard him say, Hollywood, the media, the banks, maybe they played a big role in the formation of communism or capitalism. And in fact, I said 0.2% of the world population, 2.2% of the American population, 22% of Nobel laureates. So they are dominant in certain parts of our thinking. And so, and for many, many years, of course, it has been the number one form of hate. The reason we're talking about it, though, is there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism as the oldest form of hate. It has become more both prevalent in terms of being visible, but also insidious and more important on college campuses. And in the last year, 43% of Jewish students on college campuses have reported, that's not specifically at Oakland, but across the country, have experienced some form of anti-Semitism. They've reported this. And so that's one of the reasons why we've decided that this is a topic that is deserving of being discussed today. And 24% of Jewish students have actually said that they have experienced being blamed for some activity that has occurred in Israel, and somebody has told them that they're responsible for that. Imagine being a student at an American university of any race or any religion and being told that you're responsible for an activity of the American government, either the current government or the past government. And American Jewish students are not citizens of Israel. So this is something that is very concerning to us.
So in the comments that you both made me think of something as a bit of a follow-up to that. And you both mentioned the media. And I'm not in traditional terms that I want to ask you about, but social media, right? And one of the things, and President Peskovitz knows this very, very well, but one of the things we try to do with all of our work at the Center for Civic Engagement is inject civility into difficult topics. And I will thank her for her unwavering support on our efforts to do that. But one of the places where we see incivility the most these days is social media. And I wonder if you think, and we're just speculating here, but it popped into my head, so I'll ask, does social media, do you think, make it easier to be overtly anti-Semitic? Because we know in other instances that folks will say things in a social media platform, on a social media platform, that they would never say to somebody face to face, right? So I wonder if you think that is likely to be furthering this rise or injecting the anti-Semitic incidents into our culture.
I don't have any doubt that social media really perpetuates and foments all kinds of hate. It makes it, because it's anonymous and because it really facilitates people's ability to get into groupthink and enable people to say whatever they want, really without accountability. It really perpetuates every kind of hate.
That bubble
including anti-Semitism.
absolutely, that bubble is
It's
really
not
strong,
limited-
right?
It's not limited to anti-Semitism, but it is certainly really, without any doubt, absolutely accelerates it.
Yeah, and I would also say, in conjunction with a number of other recent factors, which include, unfortunately, the previous administration in the United States, a kind of normalization of anti-Semitic discourse, a kind of moving of the boundaries of civil discourse so that no longer is something so outrageous that people raise their eyebrows. Instead, this is just part of this growing landscape, and all discourses are equal to each other. And there are ways in which you can try to police things like Twitter to get rid of overt hate speech. But much of what we're dealing with is also a much more insidious form of hate speech. But I do totally agree that social media has normalized racist dialogue. In a way.
That's a really interesting way to put it, right? Is that it's normalized it, that we've become desensitized to it in a lot of ways, right? And that's a jarring thing, I think, when we think about that it no longer maybe makes us take a step back or question it even, right? Let's talk a little bit about and I'm going to preface this by saying I don't think we need to get into politics in the Middle East, but there's certainly a connection, right? But let's start with this. There seems to be a presentation of anti-Semitism in the U.S. anyway that can almost be divided between left and right in our politics, right? Where we see maybe some more overt, explicit anti-Semitic statements from the far right wing, but on the far left, we get maybe more that's implicit, right? And I guess what I'm thinking about there is the BDS movement, boycott, disinvest, and sanction, right? Any thoughts on that, or am I off base on the divide there?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is true. It's sort of easy to detect some problematic aspects of a bunch of very fine people marching with tiki torches through Charlottesville, Virginia, shouting that the Jews will not replace us. That's so in your face in a way that I think we can sort of recognize that as what it is. Its effective. Its effectiveness relies on its bluntness and lack of sophistication. But there are other forms of what I would have to define as anti-Semitism that are much more difficult to identify and much more difficult to disavow, because they're cloaked in kind of an objective critique, not necessarily of policies of the state of Israel. And you said we don't want to get into Middle East politics. I think that's absolutely true, but basically aiming to delegitimize Israel completely, right? And I think here there is a movement. Dr. Dulio mentioned it: boycott, divest, and sanctions, that has as its goal basically blacklisting Israeli scholars, trying to use the resources of academic communities to punish Israel. And my problem with the BDS movement, among other things, is it misses much of the nuance that exists within Israeli politics itself. You may have watched in the news more recently. I am not a fan of the current administration in Israel. I am, in fact, what is the opposite of being a fan? I don't want to get graphic of the Netanyahu regime. I would say the attempt to overhaul the judiciary, that sort of thing. What I think is oftentimes missed until recently is the strength of a sort of oppositional voice within Israel, not only regarding the overhaul of the judiciary, but regarding the treatment of Palestinians and these sorts of things. And a blanket BDS approach that's oftentimes embraced on academic campuses, is typically on the left politically, punishes the forces within Israel that need encouragement in order for Israel to change and become a better place that tangibly improves the lives of Palestinians and Israelis both. The BDS movement is not arguing, let's create the conditions for a two-state solution. The goal pretty much, and I don't want to speak with too much of a broad brush, but the goal is delegitimization. And I think that is hugely problematic. Criticism of Israel is absolutely legitimate. Criticism of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and Israeli policy, completely legitimate. The goal of simple delegitimization, I would argue, is much more problematic and comes much closer to being anti-Semitic ideology, if not overt anti-Semitism. Did you have?
That's an interesting, what's going through my head now, and this gets back to some of the statistics that President Peskovitz mentioned. The fact that Jewish students in America are maybe blamed for the government of Israel. Is there a blurring of the lines between somebody who is Jewish in the United States and then Israel, right? I think a lot of folks for that it almost is an overlap when that's not the case. And does that cause a problem or does that help that rise of anti-Semitism, that a lot of folks don't know the difference between somebody who is Jewish by faith here in the United States and then somebody who is a citizen of Israel?
Well, I think that is an interesting point. But first of all, of course, Jews in America, for the most part, are not citizens of the state of Israel. And there is sometimes an expectation that because they're Jewish, they have this automatic, loyalty to another country. They may have a strong affinity for the state of Israel, but it's important to remember, as Derek has been mentioning, that Israel is a democracy. In fact, the only democracy in the Middle East. And it is a very strong democracy. And if you've been reading the news, as you've just been alluding to, it is a very strong democracy. It's worth, we're not going to talk too much about the Israeli current political situation, but it is really worth mentioning if you happen to read today's newspaper, just as an example, a simple example. And I think we probably share political views, and I really didn't want to get into them either, but Bibi Netanyahu is supposed to go to Italy today to talk to the Italian prime minister, can't get there because the Israeli pilots aren't taking him there. The Israeli translator who's supposed to translate his speech in Italian to the Italian prime minister won't translate for him. The Israeli Air Force pilots are protesting. The reservists are protesting. So you have hundreds of thousands of people who have blocked the road to the airport who won't let him get there. So the entire Israeli public is in protest of this current Israeli government. And so I think it's very important for people to understand that not only is the rest of the world in protest of the current Israeli government, but the Israeli public is in protest as well. And so I think that this is a critical thing for people to understand. So for non-Jews in America to blame American Jews and especially American Jewish students for what is happening in Israel is so outrageous. When you have the Israeli public doing their own protesting is something for the sophisticated American students on American campuses to understand. This is what we have to do at a university, is elevate the level of sophistication to study political science, to study what is happening in another country, and not just blanketly blame students for something that they're certainly nowhere near responsible for.
Sure. This is before we switch gears a little bit, this gives me a chance to remind our folks who are watching via Zoom, as well as folks here in the audience in the Oakland Center, and thanks to Chris Reed for letting us set up shop here in the Winter Garden. We've got a question on Q&A, and folks on Zoom, if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A feature. An anonymous attendee has asked, how can the community learn about anti-Semitic tropes in a respectful way that allows us to recognize the rhetoric and call out hatred on the spot, either online or in person? It's a little off topic, but I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Well, it's actually not really off topic. and I think it's really great. And I actually wrote down a list of some of those tropes, and that's one of the reasons I have some notes here. But the ADL is really a great resource for this kind of thing. But I did write down some of those specific tropes. And I think the statistic, and I didn't write the statistic, but I believe 85%, I may not have that number right, but I believe it's a very high percent of the American public believes one of these tropes to be true. So that statistic may be wrong, but these are the tropes that American Jews have an excessive amount of, and these are the tropes: power, loyalty, greed, that Jews killed Jesus, the blood rituals that you referred to. They believe that the Holocaust did not happen, or there's this criticism of Israel. And those are the tropes. And I just happened to write those down, maybe anticipating that question.
So is it about information? And what we're going to come back to the college campus atmosphere specifically, but how do you fight it, right? How do you battle? How can folks who are concerned about tone and anti-Semitic incidents on the rise, how can we combat it? Is it as simple as making sure people are informed about reality versus myth?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think the real difficulty is what's needed is nuance and context, and the ability to differentiate and not treat everything as a sort of flat table approach, which is the easiest thing to do and is magnified by social media, magnified by sound bites, these sorts of things. And so one of the things, and this ties into what you asked before, where can somebody go to learn in an objective way, not a racist way about anti-Semitic tropes? I don't want to sort of treat Jewish history entirely through the prism of the Holocaust. That is hugely problematic for different reasons. But the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has, for my money, not that I have any money in the game, but from where I sit, has by far the best collection both of realistic and objective accounts of anti-Semitism through the centuries, and the sort of distillation of the most recent scholarship on trying to explain and understand the Holocaust. And so it's not entirely about the Holocaust, but I think in answering your question, the need is for nuance. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, ushmm.org, offers that kind of nuance and objectivity, and it's very important. And so on top of that, then yes, knowledge. I think a big part of the problem is lack of knowledge and this sort of instinctual response to certain cues that come through popular media that trigger people to think they have some sort of well-reasoned conviction, when it really is simply a kind of emotive naivete, right? So information and nuance, I think, are both important.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Holocaust, because let's talk about that for a bit. And Holocaust denial. Your research, Dr. Hastings, is centers on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, right? That's what you studied. Do you see any parallels between the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the U.S. today and developments from the Nazi era?
Wow. Okay. Yes. In a way, sort of aside just from the instance or the appearance of anti-Semitism, political polarization of the extent which existed in pre-Nazi Germany in the Weimar Republic and in present-day United States, that provides the kind of space, the cracks between different members of the body politic, different members of society, offer a lot of space for the weeds of anti-Semitism to kind of grow up and flourish. And so I think part of the problem is political polarization in the present situation. Now, in terms of Holocaust denial, I've seen soft forms of it in the classroom. I think not necessarily a desire to say the Holocaust didn't happen, but to sort of question either the numbers or how can we ever really know, and sort of what I've seen is a kind of provinciality. I love Oakland students in part because so many of them are first generation college students, but that brings with it a lot of lack of contact with other types of people that may be different from them. And I think what happens oftentimes is students will hear an uncle who might be anti-Semitic say something about the Jews, and they don't know anybody personally, and this can kind of morph in a way into a lack of sympathy at the bare minimum, or an open questioning or skepticism towards something like the Holocaust on the part of certain students. And so I think it's important to kind of combat this with open dialogue, objective dialogue, and as much nuance as we can have.
You know, it is so hard to believe the atrocities that happened. Last night, Dan and I had a dinner with Holocaust survivors, and I myself am the daughter of Holocaust survivors in my family. And when you stop and think about these atrocities and you try to actually imagine what happened, and we talked about it last night at dinner, we ourselves could not believe what actually happened. We discussed this last night at dinner. It's incomprehensible, the way that people were actually treated. And we said it last night at our dinner, that we couldn't believe it ourselves. And this other couple and we were actually children and grandchildren of these people who did not survive. And we couldn't believe it. So imagine it, when I gave you the statistics of people who've never even met a Jew, how could they imagine it? And so it's possible for me to understand why people can't believe it.
That's really interesting, right? And I had never thought about that until you said it, that when you hear the stories, when you hear the history, right? When you hear the facts of it, you could see why somebody would say, oh, come on. No way.
How could someone put
happen?
someone in a gas chamber?
That's really
How could they starve them to death? How could they do this to other people?
Yeah, and I would also add the logistical, when you study the Holocaust in detail, how it unfolded in practice, the logistical complexity of the attempt to eradicate the Jews of Europe is unthinkable. And on top of the why of it. And so just to go back to this point, a very eminent Holocaust scholar, Peter Hayes from Northwestern University, published recently a book entitled Why? Because one of the central questions we get from students is, how on earth does this become conceivable, let alone policy? It is so fantastical in a way. And so my short answer always to students is, it's good if you're mystified by this. If somehow or another anti-Semitic, Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust makes some kind of even rudimentary sense to you, you have major issues. Okay, this is on you, because the why of it is so fantastical. It's so difficult to get your brain around. So I feel the same way.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, and let's continue on this path of modern Holocaust denial. So I think it was a Marist survey from last year of just millennials and Gen Z individuals, found that 90% of respondents said that they believed the Holocaust happened. 90. 7% weren't sure, and 3% said flat out no. So, and one of the most disturbing revelations of that, when I dug into this survey a little bit more, was that 11% of those millennials and Gen Z individuals thought that Jews caused the Holocaust, and that number goes up to 19% in the state of New York, right? So is this a sign that Holocaust denial might just ratchet up?
I'm afraid, in part because of statistics like that, which I think are part of the sort of blame the victim mentality that we see emerging in different contexts. But the real difficult thing is, as the generations of even very youthful people who were very young when they went through the Holocaust, the generations of Holocaust survivors increasingly no longer being with us, as the years progress, it becomes all the more important to document and openly discuss the realities that were realities while the survivors were still alive, so that we maintain the fact that they are still realities after the generations of Holocaust survivors no longer are with us. And so my concern is, in part, what do you do when you can no longer turn to somebody who went through these events? The fear is that it's going to become much more normalized to treat this as just an unknowable mystification from the past. Who can know the truth? Let's move on. Let's forget about it. If somebody wants to talk about the Holocaust, then they're open to hostility or skepticism, and that is a fear that I have looking forward.
So this is another time to remind folks that because we've got several audience questions that we'll get to here, and if you're on Zoom, use that Q&A function. Put your questions right in there. If you're here in person in the OC and you've got a question, raise your hand, shout it out, do whatever you like, and we'll take it on. I'm going to ask this one, and this is directed at Dr. Hastings from a colleague in the poli-sci department. Professor Epstein is watching on Zoom, and he's got a question. Asked Derek, aren't you overlooking an important nuance of the BDS movement, say as expressed by Jewish Voice for Peace, which is that the goal is to delegitimize a military occupation in its 56th year? Not to put you on the spot, but
I have sympathy with the attitudes behind several of my colleagues. I have no idea. I haven't talked to Alan about this at all. Alan's great.
Well, now you
we've
are.
talked in the
Right, there you
past,
go.
right? Exactly. So I can infer certain things, but the fact is, you can be harshly critical of the Israeli lack of respect for 1967 borders, for the or what's happened in terms of West Bank settlements and that sort of thing. You can do that without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I guess it's possible. I think the distinction that it sounds like Alan is making is between the delegitimization of the occupation and the delegitimization of the state of Israel. Okay, if I'm misinterpreting that, then I'll own that, and I can clarify later. The problem in reality is that by not working for something like a two-state solution, which is increasingly being seen as unrealistic, in part because of the encroachment of settlements into the West Bank, in not working for something practical, I see on balance, the BDS approach to be counterproductive. And so I don't want to overlook the fact that many people who are engaged are trying to delegitimize the occupation as opposed to delegitimizing Israel. But I find the distinction difficult in the end to sort of buy, I guess, from where I sit. So that would be my answer.
Fair. And I think, you know what, this is a great example, right? You've got, well, we're doing it through technology. We're doing it through the magic of video conference, but right, two very smart individuals who've got a little different take on an important issue, right? That's the kind of thing, in my view, that is supposed to happen on a college campus between folks can disagree about things, do it in a very reasonable way. Nobody's yelling at each other, right? I mean, that's terrific. And we're going to continue on that trend with another question from the audience. This one's anonymous, and this person says, I'm a professor of Jewish studies. I have no idea if that's here at OU or not, but I'm a professor of Jewish studies, and I can tell you from the inside that Jewish studies faculty are largely not only not protesting the anti-Zionism coming from the other academic fields, but are often going along with it. This is so even when their anti-Zionism is grounded in anti-Semitic tropes. How can we delegitimize anti-Semitism of the left when Jewish studies gives it a seal of approval? And that one may not be answerable. Maybe that's more of a comment than
I would take that
question.
As a comment. That would be very difficult for me to answer responsibly.
Fair enough.
Who hasn't spent much time in Jewish studies departments.
Another really good lesson, right, from these kinds of discussions, that it's okay to say you don't know, right? That's fine.
Or can't come up with a nuanced enough answer. Right?
Fair enough. Alan says thank you.
Thank you to Alan. And I'm shouting the thank you. You said we would shout at each other. I'm shouting my thank you back to him.
Any questions here from the audience in the Oakland Center? Josh Koss, former political science student here at Oakland University, getting his PhD at Michigan State. So I'll repeat the question for those on Zoom who may not have been able to hear that. Josh is as I said, a former student getting his PhD. He's also an instructor at Michigan State these days, and has seen anti-Semitic tropes, maybe not overt, but maybe and not under the radar either. But they're coming out nonetheless. The question gets to that.
So how do you deal with that in the classroom? Should I take this one then? Is
Sure.
that, yeah. I think with openness. So I think it's entirely legitimate to announce at the beginning of a course that may have this sort of a dynamic in it, that you're going to allow free expression of opinions on both sides of whatever issue you may be talking about, as long as you're not debating gravity, that sort of a thing. I mean, as long as there are two sides, you'll allow open discourse. But what I typically say, and this doesn't come up that often, but how I would handle it would be to say anti-Semitic tropes in this course are going to be called out as anti-Semitic tropes. And you have the freedom within this class, if we have open discussion, to tell me why you think you're not engaging in an anti-Semitic trope right now. And I will listen, but I'm not going to shut you down and tell you that you cannot represent your opinion in this class. But as an instructor, it's my responsibility, in a way, from where I sit, to call out what I see are anti-Semitic tropes. And if it escalated, and it's hard for me to envision this in the context of one of my classes, but it could happen. If it escalated, then I would draw the line clearly at someone persisting in what I would call hate speech, and that would be indefensible, I think, in the context of a classroom. I don't know if that answers your question.
So I'm glad Josh brought that up. Let's talk about it at a more local level. Let's focus in on college campuses. But before we talk about OU, what do you both think the role of higher ed in general is in terms of trying to prevent the rise of anti-Semitic incidents, the continuation of the anti-Semitic tropes? Where does higher ed, as broadly speaking, fit in?
Well, I will just say that I think we have a very important role to play. And actually, a year ago, ACE held a very important conference in New York. I was not invited to attend, but there were 40 presidents from across the country that attended a very important conference. We, as you know, are planning a conference here this fall, and we believe that higher ed has a critical role to play. And so this is one of our first forays into that topic. And I think that higher ed needs to play an important role. You know, our focus right now is anti-Semitism on college campuses, but I think that by being the front edge of that, we have an opportunity to also expand into hopefully stopping this increasing trend of anti-Semitism on college campuses, and that will expand into hopefully halting anti-Semitism across the country, and also hopefully stopping other forms of hate. You know, we know, all of you know how important it is to us to be an open and tolerant campus that really welcomes all in every regard. And this is a form of hate that we very much oppose. And it's one example of the kinds of things that we are trying very hard to promote.
And how about, I mean, let's think about what somebody who attends college or university gets when they come, right? Because we know, for instance, in political science research, that the more education you get, the more tolerant you are of other opinions and attitudes, right? So when folks come to Oakland University, what we want them to get is a well-rounded education and learn skills like critical thinking and analysis, right? But they also get exposure to topics through general education, like Western civilization, right? And those Western Civ courses. Is that a real key part of is the skills and things that folks are exposed to on college campuses? Is that a real key part in tamping down anti-Semitism and all forms of hate?
It tamps down the anti-Semitism of the right.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's one thing to respond to the defacement of painting a swastika on somebody's dorm room door, or trying to affix pork to somebody's dorm room door or something like that. There are other forms that may not necessarily be addressed by that sort of thing. But I do think, at least in the majority of cases, it is important not only to teach the information that people may not be coming into college with, but to teach those critical, nuanced thinking skills that people are going to need, not only to be able to respond to various appeals to them at various points in their life, political appeals, religious appeals, advertisements, who knows, to be able to sort through in a nuanced way, to be able to understand what the background of something is. That can't help but have a positive effect on at least many forms of anti-Semitic ideology. Yeah.
So even more local. Let's talk about OU. Have either of you seen anti-Semitic or experienced anti-Semitic incidents? And if so, what's the response? What do we do about those as an institution?
You know, I did experience a few episodes personally during our when we were rolling out our mandates, our vaccine mandates. You know, I get a lot of hate mail. I will just say, you probably are not surprised to hear that. I get all kinds of hate mail. So it's not only anti-Semitic. I think I'm well known to be Jewish. So I get all kinds of hate mail. And I would say the majority of it is not focused on my being Jewish. It comes in all forms. But during a number of times, I have received anti-Semitic hate mail as well.
Derek, anything in the classroom that you've seen?
I haven't seen kind of egregious forms of anti-Semitism sort of being planned and brought into the classroom. But what I've seen is, I'll give one example. And if anybody's watching from a former class of mine, if they were in this class, they'll remember it. We were talking about children in the Holocaust, and I had one female student who hadn't come in thinking she was going to say anything anti-Semitic, but actually said something along the lines of, did Jewish people in Eastern Europe actually feel the same way about their kids as we Americans do? And that is I don't know, you can't call that something that was brought in as like, I'm going to go in and lay this anti-Semitic bomb in class. But it's even more disturbing in a way that somebody would other the Jews to such an extent that they would think it's an incomprehensible difference between us, who feel a certain way as Christian families about our kids, perhaps, I don't know where she was coming from, and the Jews of Eastern Europe, which she was assuming must have had less of a human connection with their own families. So it comes out in strange ways like that, or sort of questioning aspects of the Holocaust rather than overt anti-Semitic insults or overt Holocaust denial.
So as we're talking about this, it strikes me that a lot of the reaction to anti-Semitism is just that, it's reactive. But there are also things that are sort of proactive, right? That you can take to try to stem it before it rears its ugly head, right? And I would say that discussions like this are an example of that. But another one here that happens at OU, it's happened once. I know that there's plans to do it again, but the Oakland University William Beaumont School of Medicine has taken med students to Auschwitz, right? As I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that and the program that spurred that.
Yeah, and I know that we have Jason Wasserman here. Maybe we could invite Jason to come on up and just tell us a little bit about
absolutely
this wonderful program that we have for our second-year medical students. It's a really phenomenal program that we started, and actually it would be great if we could, maybe rather than us talking about it, come on in here, Jason. Yeah. Let's have you just
we're on the fly here, right?
Yeah.
We're making it up as we go along. Welcome, Jason.
We're really proud of this fantastic program that we offer in OUWB School of Medicine. So Jason, why don't you just tell us a little bit about that?
I was just an attendee, so I wasn't planning on
saying we saw Jason out there. I think it would be better than us talking about it. Why don't you do that?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that we're so proud to be able to contribute to the whole effort that's being done here at Oakland University to combat anti-Semitism and promote this kind of history, as you do, Derek, and in a small way. And so, and then also I'll say that the entire program would not be possible without the support of our donors. It's entirely donor funded. The students don't pay anything to go. And the inaugural donation was made by Aura herself. So I'll just, again, say thank you for that. It's an often overlooked piece of history that physicians were widely complicit in the Holocaust. They not only joined the Nazi Party at ranks well above other professions, but they participated in the sort of perverse science, or quote unquote science, that underlied a lot of the anti-Semitism and the sort of ability to dehumanize Jews and other groups. And they participated directly in the Holocaust in camps like Auschwitz, where they made the decisions of who to send to the gas chambers and who to send to work to die later. They participated in gruesome medical experiments and all sorts of executions. And so we think it's an important history for everyone to learn, but especially for our medical students, because as has been discussed today, the echoes of the Holocaust have important lessons. It's not just a history, but it's about how we other people, how we dehumanize people, and the gruesome results that can come from that. And the power invested in physicians puts them in an important place to be responsible in those ways. So we take 20 medical students every year now, and planning our second trip, and it's a really powerful, impactful experience. And again, made possible by the support of so many people, including Oakland University and Dr. Peskovich.
So Jason, what benefits do you think those medical students walk away with after that trip?
Yeah, actually, so we just did a program evaluation that we're getting kind of preliminary results on now. And what they tell us, I'll just say, instead of me maybe supposing what the benefits are, what they say the benefits are. First of all, they learn an important history. They start to think about how these sort of seeds of dehumanization can kind of creep into how one sees another person. And they can start to see the risks of that throughout medicine, where it's so easy to, for othering language to creep in, for kind of all sorts of processes of objectification and dehumanization to creep into patient care. So they see that so in such an intimate and impactful way that I think it's hard for them not to start to bring it to the center of their view of themselves as doctors. They also report, and this was actually something I didn't expect to come out of the data, but they report a tremendous personal responsibility for this content and for improving medicine in these ways. And that, to me, I think was the most heartening finding, is that they not only intellectually feel like they need to participate in making medicine better in these ways, but they now feel like a tremendous personal connection and personal responsibility for doing so.
And we were talking before about reactions, and I wonder if, I'm just curious, what do you see when those students walk into a place like Auschwitz, probably for the first time? What is a medical student's reaction to being in a place like that?
Yeah, it's really varied. I mean, it's if anyone's ever been to Auschwitz, there's no place on earth like it. It's the largest graveyard in human history. It's impossible to stand there and not feel just this range of emotions that you can't quite put into words. So I think what happens is we just sort of all cycle through, like, the incomprehensible. Like, I don't know if that's not emotion, but that's one thing you just constantly experience, is how incomprehensible it is. And then you hit these peaks of sadness throughout. And it's interesting because it's not all at once. It's not the same thing that affects everyone in one moment. It's different people. Something's hitting them differently because they're bringing some personal connection to it. And the way I describe it is, I've studied this stuff a lot. Now I've been on this trip with the students. I follow some social media, and the United States Holocaust Memorial posts little pictures of Holocaust survivors with a little biography on their Twitter. And I see these just about every day. And then just one morning I opened up my Twitter, and there was one of these pictures, which I normally kind of read and, just move along. But the picture was of a child that looked exactly like my son. I just completely lost it. So I think that that's kind of what happens is everybody's bringing like their personal connection to the experience. And so it's different things that are constantly triggering different people. And it can be overwhelming for sure.
I bet. We've got just a couple minutes left. If there are any last questions, either from, here we go. Interesting. From another former student, Mary Drabick. Hi, Mary. Does OU recognize or utilize a specific definition of anti-Semitism on campus among staff or students? That's interesting. Is there a specific definition that we would use of anti-Semitism and Mary didn't ask this, but I imagine as a way to say, okay, that crosses the line. Even because even Derek said, right, hate speech would, but even that's a fuzzy definition.
I don't know that we use one, but I did look that up too.
Okay.
Because
Sure.
because I wanted
Yeah.
to know what is the official definition. So you want me to read you
Please
what I
go
went
right
there?
ahead. Yeah.
Because I don't think that it's an Oakland definition. Again, I got this from the ADL. So the official definition apparently is hostility towards Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group.
Okay.
Because I didn't know what the official
Sure.
definition was either.
I hope that helps answer your question, Mary. Any other questions here in the Winter Garden of the Oakland Center? Hearing none. Okay. Well, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thanks to those who came and enjoyed the discussion here on campus. Thanks to the many who are joining via Zoom, and thanks to our august panel, President Peskovitz. We know your calendar is packed and loaded. We thank you very much for taking time to sit and talk with us for a while. Professor Hastings, thank you very much for your expertise. And a special guest appearance, Jason Wasserman, professor in the OUWB. Thanks very much for it. And keep an eye out for other stuff from the Center for Civic Engagement and our next office hours session. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Oh, yeah. No,